This is an interview with Alphonso Beverly on August 17, 2002, at the Virginia Holocaust Museum in Richmond, Virginia, conducted by Patty O'Connor. Could you tell us from which city and state you're originally from?
I'm originally from a small village in Alabama, just east of Birmingham. It was Lubbock, Alabama.
What was your civilian occupation before World War II?
I didn't have what is known as a regular civilian because I was drafted at the age of 18.
Which branch and division of the armed forces were you in?
I was with the Quartermaster Corps.
In the Army?
Yes.
Could you please state your name, rank, and serial number?
Alphonso Beverly. My serial number was 34919-199. My rank at the time that I was in service with the unit that I took basic training with, I eventually became the first sergeant of that unit.
What was your military occupation?
Initially, I started as a driver for the platoon leader of the platoon that I was training with. Subsequently, I became the dispatcher for the company. The company was a light quartermaster truck company. And after which, when we went overseas, went to Europe, of course, I became the truck master of a heavy trucking company. The unit in which I was with redesignated to a heavy trucking company.
And how long were you in the service?
I spent 31 plus years in the service.
Did you receive any military decorations?
Yes, the highest, of course, was the Bronze Star.
And what others did you receive?
Well, the Commendation Ribbon, European Theater of Operation. I was in service during the Korean War, and I spent all of World War II during my tour of duty in Europe. And I have all of the basic ribbons that were given, to include the Battle Star for the Rhine. The unit in which I was with, we were awarded the Battle Star for the crossing of the Rhine River.
What was the name of the concentration camp that you viewed when transporting refugees?
I'm not sure of the name anymore because I had the camps a little bit confused, but I do recall Holland. We referred to them as displaced personnel out of a concentration camp that was located just within the Munich area, and then also the Nuremberg area.
What war experiences have you participated in before arriving at either of those camps?
None other than the duties that we performed as trucking units. However, in hauling supplies from France up to Germany and whatnot, the convoys in which our companies participated in, they were strafed from time to time by the German Air Force. But as far as coming in physical contact, combat with any of the German soldiers, we didn't have any of that. We transported a lot of German prisoners, but we didn't come in contact with them fighting.
Which camp did you arrive at first? The one near Dachau, or the one near Munich, or the one near Nuremberg?
The one near Munich.
And when did you arrive?
We arrived, it was about the third week after the Germans had surrendered.
And when did you arrive at the one near Nuremberg?
About 2 weeks later.
Do you know if they were labor camps or death camps?
I'm not sure because at the time I wasn't that familiar with them, and of course we did not go in and out of the camps per se. They had regular places that they assembled the people, and we referred to it as cargo that we were hauling. But we didn't go inside the camps or tour the camps per se.
How old were you at that time?
19.
What did you see in the camps?
Well, we saw very little of the camps. What we saw mostly as far as the camps was concerned were just buildings. And of course, they had huge gates at all of those camps. I can remember that. But we never actually went inside of any of those camps.
When you transported the refugees, were you at the camps receiving them?
Yes, we picked them up at camps, at one of their processing buildings.
So it wasn't, you didn't actually go
No,
anywhere
we did
inside
not
the
go
camp?
inside the camps at all.
Can you describe the condition of the refugees?
Well, at that time, you have to bear in mind that the war had been over for several weeks at that time, so we did not see any of those that were in what you might say devastated condition. Most of the ones that we saw could help themselves as far as walking, and it appeared to us that a lot of these were families because there were children. And it appeared by just looking at them, you could tell that there apparently was some family connections.
Did you see any bodies of prisoners that had died before your arrival, or did you work only with the refugees?
No, we only saw the ones that were alive.
Did any of them speak English? Were you able to
Oh
communicate?
yes, oh yes. They would ask you about, different things concerning the war. How long had you been there, and did you hear about them? And different things, the conditions in which they had suffered and that type. There was some that could carry on as well of a conversation as you could hear from anyone else that spoke English.
What were some of the things they told you that they had endured?
Well, basically, I think that they had been orientated to the extent that they were not to be discussing that, basically with us. Because we were not part of what we refer to as a civil action company. My company, as I indicated, was strictly a trucking unit. Now, with the civil affairs type units, I'm sure that they went into more detail in just talking with them. The people that we came in contact with basically was from just about every country, imaginable. And we even hauled people back to France. They were Frenchmen that were carried to Germany to work in labor camps.
Were any of them Jews or political prisoners as well?
As far as we were concerned, they were all basically Jewish people.
And where did you transport these refugees?
Well, one of the groups that we brought from Nuremberg were carried to a place just outside of Lampenheim, which was just a few miles from Mannheim. They had a large DP plant there. And I also remember carrying some from a DP camp in Nuremberg to Kissingen, a place known as Kissingen. It was about 75, 80 miles from Nuremberg.
What was the condition of the camps, the DP camps?
Well, physically we didn't see any of that. We had designated drop-off points, and as far as getting around inside those camps. But the DP camps just looked like regular, some of them were tents, basically they were set up as tents. But you could see that there was construction going on in some of the areas to indicate that they were going to be made permanent type, facilities, or at least temporary in a better shape than just a plain tent.
Can you tell me anything more about the French refugees?
No, because once we brought them to Metz, and once we dropped them off, because the French government took over, at that point, and the only thing we were doing primarily were transporting them back And it was ironic because we were also, the company in which I was assigned was also, had the commitments that we hauled German prisoners that had spent most of the war here in the United States from France back to Germany. That they came over on the troop ships that our servicemen were going to be going back to the States on or going to the Pacific on.
What was that like, transporting German prisoners?
Well, it was a lot better than hauling those than it was to haul Germans from Germany into France, because you never knew in hauling them when you were going to get attacked by the Frenchmen. You know, it would be very difficult for you as a driver to try to protect a truckload of Germans if your truck broke down and whatnot in a small village, because there was a lot of hatred between the French, you know, and the Germans. And the Germans knew this. The German prisoners, they knew this just as well as we did. And it was difficult, you know, hauling. As a matter of fact, we had been strafed, you know, by the Air Force when hauling the German prisoners. You know, bringing them out of Germany into France. And of course, when they were brought into France, at that time, basically, most of them were used, you know, to work in different depots and whatnot, you know, for the Allies. We also had a bunch of Russian prisoners that had been German prisoners of war down in France, working in the different depots.
How did the German prisoners of war act? What was their attitude?
Well, their attitude was, it was difficult, because when I say it was difficult, because most of the ones that we came in contact with were very young or old. You know, they were very young or old. And they were just, I think, this is my impression, they were just glad to be away from the fighting. However, it was, they would have, we would have MP escorting those convoys, basically. But some of the horrifying things that would happen is that when we got to a camp and was unloading them, and they were going through a search, some of the things that they was taken off of those individuals, weapons and things of this nature, that, in other words, you've been hauling them all night and they still had weapons and ammunition, you know. But basically, they were not the ones that we picked up that had spent time here in the States. Now, they were very cocky. They were very, very cocky, you know, going back into Germany, because we hauled them from Normandy back to Germany, and we carried them to Kaiserslautern. Was one of the drop-off places that we carried the Germans that had been in the States, and we carried them back to Kaiserslautern. That's where they were dropped off. And they'd been in the States all during the war, you know, basically. Some of them had been captured in Africa, you know, in North Africa. And as a matter of fact, quite a few of them had been captured, you know, in North Africa. And some of them had been just about all over the United States.
Did any of them speak English?
Oh, yes.
Did they tell you anything about their experiences in the American war camp?
Well, believe it or not, we had a lot of experience with them, because, you know, and where I took basic training, which was at Camp Rucker, it's now Fort Rucker, Alabama, most of the warehouses were operated by the Germans. They had Americans there as their supervisors, but as far as filling out the requisitions and all of that, they did all of that. They did all of that, every bit of it. And they also had them working in the laundries. Now, I wasn't part of it, but I do know that there were German prisoners that left Rucker every day that went to work in the fields for the local farmers. They would hire them out, by the day and whatnot.
Can you compare the conditions and the treatment of the German prisoners here in America to the way the Germans treated their prisoners of war?
I don't think there was any comparison. The Germans received, I know, 3 basic meals per day. Excuse me. Having not been a prisoner of war, but talked to very few Americans that had been, they did not receive that type of treatment. The German prisoners were very comfortable in the United States, very comfortable. Their living quarters, their clothing, and all of this. They changed uniforms more frequent than a lot of us did. And believe it or not, they were able to wear that same uniforms, especially their officers. The same uniforms their officers wore, because they, at all camps, even the German prisoners that worked in my company in France, every company in France, every military company that was in France had an opportunity to get German prisoners based on the type unit that you were with to work in your unit. We had them that worked in our motor pool as mechanics. We had them to work in our dining facilities as cooks and what we refer to as KPs, kitchen people. And of course they had those that just did general cleaning. But those were the type individuals. But there was always a German officer, at least one German officer with any that you had. In my company, it just so happened that we were authorized a total of 32. So we had to provide a special place for 32 additional people. And of course, they ate after we did, but our cooks prepared the food for them, along with their cooks.
It's interesting. They were treated so well, but when they returned to Germany, they had a cocky attitude still.
Well, basically, because see, they returned with money. They had money. And most of the American troops that I know of that was in France didn't have a footlocker. You know what a footlocker is? Well, each German prisoner of war that got off of the ship had a footlocker that he was issued when he left the States to bring his clothing home in. And any of his personal gear.
And where did the money come from that they had?
Well, the money was from, to the best of my knowledge, the government paid, they got so much a day for being a prisoner of war.
Like the labor they were doing?
Right, and all of that had a lot to do with it. But the Germans that had skills were utilized because they were screened to that extent to determine, what skills they had. And they put those skills to work, of course, to our advantage.
And what was your experience with the Russian prisoners of war?
The biggest experience with them was a language barrier, but they were hard-working individuals, there were large containers that would have motors in them, truck motors and whatnot. We hauled a little of everything. Instead of using a forklift or something of that nature to load that equipment with, those Russians loaded it by hand. Not one truck, but I've seen them load many trucks by hand.
What was their attitude?
They seemed to have a very good attitude because they ate well, they had a nice place to sleep, and a comfortable place to sleep.
And were they returned to Russia?
I don't know their status because I didn't come in contact with them, but at two places, and one of them was the one that had more experience with was the one in Marseille, at a large depot in Marseille. And when we were operating on the Yellow Diamond Highway, we operated between Marseille and Metz, France.
Are there any other details that you want to share about the Russian prisoners of war that you can think of?
No, basically no, but they were just hard-working individuals. Now, the Russians, there were very few of the Russians that we saw working at what we had known as rest stops. On the Red Ball and the Yellow Diamond Highway, there were rest stops, and at those rest stops, you could stop there to get a cup of coffee and even a meal, and they were operated by and large, as far as the work is concerned, it was done either by the Russians or by German prisoners.
The German prisoners that you returned to Germany, do you know what happened to them?
No, I don't, because once we dropped them off, that was it. But they would be processed there, from what I understand, to go to their respective homes or wherever they wanted to go. Now, there was a difference. You had the East Germans and the West Germans, those that lived in the eastern part of Germany and the ones that lived in the western part of Germany. I don't have any idea what happened, because the only place that we carried them was, as I indicated, Kaiserslautern.
Do you know approximately how many refugees you transported?
No, I don't, because sometime we would have maybe 6 or 7 trucks, and we didn't load them the same way we would load a German prisoner, because basically we wanted them, if possible, to sit down. And most of the German prisoners, when we were loading them, depending on how many they had, if we only had 10 trucks, we were going to try to put all of them on those 10 trucks, In other words, they was packed in there pretty tight. But when we were hauling the DPs, we tried to make it as comfortable, for them as possible. We didn't have special seats or anything, in the trucks, because a stake and platform truck, you either sit on the floor or stand up. And inasmuch as they were not being hauled as far as we were hauling the German prisoners, the ride wasn't that uncomfortable, to a great extent. It wasn't that uncomfortable.
You mentioned that there seemed to be families. Were there more men or women or children?
There appeared to have been more women than men that we hauled.
What ages were they?
Oh, I would say that they aged from, I'd say, about 10 years old up until 60 or more. Because I talked to a family, and I know that I recall the man, of course, he was the one that was doing most of the talking. He was in his 60s. He was over 60 years old.
Do you know how long they had been in the camps?
Various times. Some had been there 8, 9 years. In that same camp for that length of time, 8 or 9 years.
Did most of them seem to be more recent arrivals at the camp, though?
No. It appeared that most of the ones that we came in contact with had been there for a while, not recent arrivals.
Were you ever responsible for hauling food or clothing or any supplies to the DP camps?
No. Basically, when we hauled everything at one time as far as the DP camps were concerned. If they had any supplies, it all went with us. and if there was any food and whatnot, it went along with us. But it wasn't picked up basically at this point. We picked it up more or less from a Class 1 point, the food.
You saw hostility from the French toward the German prisoners of war. Did you see any kind of hostility toward the Jewish refugees as they were being transported?
Oh, no, no,
Did you witness any kind of anti-Semitic?
no, none whatsoever.
Do you know what happened to the refugees once they were in the DP camps?
No, we do not.
Have you returned to either of the camps since that time?
Oh, no, because most of the camps at that time, and my subsequent tours of duty in Germany were no longer in existence. The ones that I was familiar with had come in contact with any at all. They were not in existence.
So what other tours in Europe did you do? What years?
Initially, I went to France. To England in 1945, and from 1945 up until 1946, I was in France, England, France, and Germany. I returned to the United States in 1946, returned to Germany in 1950, returned from Germany to the States in 1955, returned to Germany again in 1957, returned to the States in 1960, and I went to France in 63, in 65 I went to Vietnam. In 1969, I served in Korea.
Did you notice any significant differences in Germany when you returned in 1950, 1957 from what it was like in 1945?
Yes, a lot of the rubbish was cleared up. A lot of the rubbish was cleared up. I was stationed in a city that was devastated during the war, that being Darmstadt, Germany. I'm sure that a lot of people in America read about some of the devastation that went on there, and it didn't take them long. They were doing a lot of, cleaning up, and that was one of the things that these civil affairs units, along with the military headquarters and the local governments, really paid a lot of attention to, and that was to get the cities and the places back to operating all of the systems, the rail, with the exception of air, the rails and the buses, and that type thing. So they spent a lot of effort in doing that, and of course it was all done by the Germans, basically, the Germans themselves.
And what about the German people? Did you see any difference in their attitude?
Well, yes. Well, during the hostilities, the young folk, the kids, they were joyous. They seemed to have been excited about just seeing you and seeing that you were not going to harm them. But the other people, they went about their business, as if to not try to pay any attention to you whatsoever. But as time went on, even before I came back to the States in 46, you could tell that there were somewhat of a friendly atmosphere toward them, because most of the American units had Germans working for them, and all of the depots and whatnot, they were primarily staffed, to work by the Germans. In other words, that was finding jobs for them, as they were getting back on their feet.
Did you see any evidence of neo-Nazism in those later years?
No, I didn't come in contact with any, but I came in contact with individuals that had been, you know, but they didn't care to talk about it, didn't care to speak about it at all.
But they admitted that they had?
Oh, yes, yes, they admitted that they had been, and seemingly enjoyed it while they were, you know, a part of it. But as far as discussing it in great detail or length, no, they didn't. No, not with me, they didn't. Even with those that, and I didn't speak German, and those that spoke English. And it was amazing that the number of people in a lot of those foreign countries that spoke English as well as they did. Very amazing.
Did you see any evidence of continuing anti-Semitism in Germany?
No, not really. No, I really didn't.
In your tour of duties in Vietnam and Korea, did you see any similarities to what happened in World War II?
Well, very little, with the exception of in Vietnam. In Vietnam, we did not have what I felt was an established front line. In Germany, I'm sorry, well, I won't say in Germany per se, but when we were fighting the Germans, there were established front lines. You know, you knew the direction that the enemy was in. In Vietnam, you didn't, you know, you didn't, because that was evidence of the Vietnamese perhaps working with you every day could be the ones that were keeping you up all night, you know, with just maybe firing one mortar shell and whatnot. So it was a big difference. You never knew. In other words, there were no established front lines in Vietnam, especially in the areas that I was in. I served in Da Nang, and I was also in Quy Nhon.
If you've not already shared your most vivid memory, could you describe it?
Pardon?
Your most vivid memory from being in Germany or France?
I think one of the things that impressed me most was how quickly the Germans were able to get things moving and to make the cities and more livable, you know, the cities and their homes and whatnot. They went through a tremendous building process. Homes, you name it, everything, factories and whatnot. And they did it, you know, primarily by themselves, you know, primarily with help, of course. And of course they had, as I indicated previously, they had the civil affairs units that they could go to that they went to rather, that serves as liaisons between them and the Americans and the British, the French and whatnot. So, but they got things back to running, I say quicker than perhaps a lot of us would have been, it would have been here in the States, especially that rail, you know, that rail system. And they had what I consider an immaculate rail system. The trains ran on time. You know, they ran on time and whatnot. And you didn't hear of a lot of accidents, you know, rail accidents. And I knew, and I know that a lot of their rails were bombed and whatnot, but still, they had overcome most of this. And it's hard. The only place in later years that I could see the evidence of some war, and that was on a trip that I made to Berlin. To Berlin, on the east side of Berlin, the homes were, the buildings gave you the impression that they were really fixed up, and that was just the front. But if you got to the ends and the sides of the building, they were in horrible shape, really. But in other words, it looked like a studio set, Everything that's facing the camera was elaborate, but things on the side and behind it was different, a lot different. And I was surprised to see that, especially in West Berlin. I mean, East Berlin. I'm sorry, East Berlin.
Almost some symbolism there.
Mm.
Have you been able to separate your feelings for Nazis from your feelings about German people?
Well, yes, I suppose so. And the reason for it is that I never came in direct contact with any, Nazism, per se. Not as an individual.
How did your war experience change your life?
Number one, I grew up. I grew up in an area. And then I had, being an 18-year-old when I came in and having the responsibility of a teenager as being the first sergeant of a unit made it quite difficult for me, at the very beginning. But, I just grew into it more or less. Because in the job that I had previous to becoming the first sergeant of the unit, I was the truck master of the unit. And as a result of being the truck master of the unit, I had control of every vehicle in the company. So as far as that responsibility was concerned, I took most all of my directions from the battalion S3, which no one in my company stood between me and them. They dealt directly with me, and then I dealt then with the other elements of the unit.
Did the experience affect your worldview of politics?
Well, I never really experienced any, politics as such. And perhaps I'm glad it didn't, because mine would have perhaps been so much different from, the real life as far as politics is concerned. There are some things that I think that I would not have done. There are some things that I think that I would have done that perhaps would not have been what we were striving for, I believe in fair play, and that type of thing, but just the manner in which you go about doing it, not being in a position to see the big picture is perhaps what I'm trying to portray.
Have you shared this information with others through the years, or not wanted to talk about it?
Well, basically, no, just in general conversation, not under the type of environment that we are under at this present.
Did you share with your relatives when you returned home from World War II what you had experienced?
Oh, yes, we talked about it from time to time.
What insight did you learn there that you could pass on to those of us who were not there?
You find some interesting people everywhere you go. And I'm amazed at the fact that I can't think of any place that I've ever been in Europe that there wasn't someone that you eventually run into that was not able to speak English. I used to always think that it was amazing to go into a restaurant, except for an example in Czechoslovakia, and they would have ribbons on to show what little flags to indicate that they spoke those different languages. And I thought that was, very interesting. And to see a waiter perhaps waiting at 2 or 3 different tables, and each one of those tables a different language being spoken. I could grasp that much of it. I could tell the difference between German Italy, and French. And I could see them talking, speaking perhaps in all three of those languages, well, four languages, because I was there and I didn't speak any of the other three, especially in Switzerland, well, any of the other countries that I'd been in. And I traveled quite a bit, while I was there and had the opportunity to go.
What one lesson do you think we should learn from remembering World War II?
And that's very difficult, very, very difficult. I don't think that it was hardly anything that we could do that we perhaps would have done a lot better under the same circumstances. I've learned that it is not necessarily that you must defeat an enemy by killing them all. You can defeat them, without having to kill them all. And for those that would allow you, I think that from time to time, you perhaps could take better care of what we refer to as that displaced personnel. In other words, with people just going, all over the country trying to find a place to settle down. I think that that could be better controlled by the country in which they're in. You see, the problem basically is that some of those countries that those people were from, Poland and a lot of those countries that later became Russia, people didn't want to go back there anyway. You follow me? And the language, to me, was a terrific barrier, because I had been around people that said that, I'm from Latvia. Well, what language do you speak in Latvia? As far as I'm concerned, I never heard of it until I came in contact with those people as being a country of their own, but later had been taken over by, the Russians. Several other countries that you come in contact with different people that said that, oh, I'm from so-and-so, I was from so-and-so, and I was from so-and-so. Now, I understood it when they said they was from Poland, and those type countries. But some of the other countries had no idea. And then and a lot of them spoke a different language, and that made it more difficult, to deal with. But I didn't have to come in contact with, dealing with them, the job that I was in.
So preparing soldiers ahead of time with some background about the countries, the language, would have helped?
Well, the language, no. I don't think that because, believe it or not, I think the American, that was part of your initial interview when you went into service, was to determine whether or not you could speak, read, or write, different foreign languages. And of course, it was annotated on your qualification cards. And that's how I'm certain that they were able to collect individuals to place in different jobs that they wanted. I don't think that it would be our duty to try to teach a foreign language, to a basic soldier. Utilize, what we have. And from all indications, we didn't do too badly there, because the thing of it is we came in contact with a lot of people that spoke English, and that helped, tremendously. That was a tremendous help to all of us.
Do you have any other ideas of ways to help with displaced persons?
No, I don't. One of the reasons that I perhaps would not have, because I'm not familiar with the administration, how they were totally administered, but I'm certain that they had a pattern, and the pattern apparently was working for them, because even those small DP camps, I understand that they did not mix a lot of the different countries into one, displaced camp. until such time as they decided that they perhaps wanted to go back to Poland or wanted to go back to Latvia or whatever. So that's why I say that it's the system that they perhaps had in mind worked very well. If anything, they perhaps could fine-tune the system that they had put into place.
How would you answer people who say the Holocaust never happened?
Basically, I would say that they were nuts because you knew that things did happen, and you saw evidence that would indicate that it happened. You know, you didn't go there to stand around to look at each and every detail of it, but you knew that something had happened because of the stench. For one thing, you could smell it, and those type things, and you knew because of the people themselves, would tell of different things that, had happened. And they were so glad to be away from it. And when you look at a person, and a person will take out a picture, some of them were able to keep pictures, and you try to compare that picture with what they look like today, at that time. I'm saying today, I'm speaking of the time that I came in contact with them. You could tell that was a difference. And the difference had a lot to do with health. I think they died, for an example. I think a lot of it had to do with that. In fact, I'm no dietitian or anything, but I'm certain that it did. I'm certain that it did.
How would you describe how they look then in comparison to their original picture?
Oh, there was a lot. It was difficult at times for you to distinguish that that's the same person that you're looking at. To me, it was,
And what specifically was different about it?
The structure, basically, the entire structure, and their skin, they looked smaller. To make a long story short, they were just smaller, just physically smaller. And you could tell that they was a person that had been under duress, a lot of strain and whatnot. You could tell that just by looking at them that they had been.
You said some of them told you some things that had happened. Do you remember any of the things they told you?
Well, it was just the long hours, basically, that they worked in the conditions in which they worked under. They were just on the hardships, They expected a lot from nothing. In other words, they would expect to do a lot with nothing, from what I can understand.
And do you know what kind of work they were required to do?
Well, no, not basically, no. They was just required to do a lot of everything. I do recall having talked to some people that were tailors that didn't do anything but make German uniforms. That's all they did, was make German uniforms.
Were most of the people, do you know if most of the people who had been there for 8 or 9 years, the ones who had jobs like that, where they were tailors or had some skill that would keep them alive?
Basically, that's what kept a lot of them alive, with the skills that they had. From, just talking with them, you could determine that. With the exception of those that had managerial skills, they were not able to put that to practice because the Germans, I don't feel, felt that they needed any managers. They wanted somebody to do some work. But other than that, I think that any person that had a skill was able to use it, and perhaps even more so than they perhaps would have if they'd have been had it been under normal circumstances.
Did any of them share what had happened to their family members?
One of the things that uh, discerned was that people had no idea where their families were, had no idea. And the ones that we found out that was trying to see if you knew were the ones that didn't speak in English, so you wasn't able to really converse with those people, you know, that would just ask you questions, and you had no idea what they were talking about. At least I didn't. And I don't think anyone in my company did, you know, had any idea what they were, you know, trying to. But you gather that they were trying to ask you something about a member of their family. Had you seen them, or, you know, or something of this nature.
What type of clothing did they wear?
Well, by this time, they had the clothing, apparently were clothing that had been given to them through the camp in which they were in, but they seemed to have been adequate. I'll put it that way. They seemed to have been adequate because they were clean, you know, and that type of thing. They were clean. And a lot of the people by then had had an opportunity to not get what you might say a thorough physical examination, but had gotten some medical help that they hadn't been exposed to for years. It would appear to me that they had.
Do you have any other last memory that you would like to share?
No, I can't think of anything specifically that I would like to share.
Well, thank you for sharing your memories and your experiences with us.
Thank you. Is this going to be a tape of this voice?